Very good. Let's start. David, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for being here. So I think a lot of folks are going to be familiar with Drift because it's become such an ubiquitous presence on a lot of websites and for a lot of companies that we're all familiar with. But just maybe to set it up, so Drift is a conversational AI platform for marketing and sales used by over 50,000 customers. The company was started in 2015. It's based in Boston. And for those who care about those things, the company has raised 107 million from a number of VCs, including Sequoia, General Catalyst, CRV. And the company is also recognized as a Forbes Cloud 100 company, which is always a nice accolade. So great stuff all around. But I'd love to start this conversation with your personal journey, David. You have been, I believe, a 5-time founder and a 2-time CEO. So I would love to hear about what you've done, prior to Drift, and maybe starting, as far back as college, because if I understand correctly, you, like many other great entrepreneurs, actually dropped out of college before starting your career. Is that right?
That's correct. I will say dropped out is too active a term. I think I just faded away from college. It wasn't that clear cut. Yeah.
And what happened next? What were the early years of your career leading to the first company that you started?
It's a long, winding story, so I'll give you the short path. I will say that that I didn't really, no one used the term entrepreneur, or no one that I knew used that term back then. And I think entrepreneur to me back then meant that you were, it was before the cult of entrepreneurship. It was, you were, did infomercials, or you had a franchise or something like that. So it was not something that I inspired to. I was obsessed with the early commercial internet, and I started to code and do things. And I would liken that time when I was doing that, it was so long ago that it felt like we were a bunch of pirates, figuring things out. There were no books. There was obviously no Google. There was no information. And so it was just a really interesting time where we could just make things. And those things led to companies. And I joined a couple early startups a long time ago. And then I started my own company in 2000, post-bubble 2000. So I have a knack for starting things in bad times. And then I've started 5, including that first one. And I always say that if you start one company, it's excusable because you're naive. 2, it's questionable, and 3 or more, which is my camp, certifiable. So I'm certifiable.
And your background is a software engineer. You came to companies from a product and technical standpoint.
Yeah, I studied software engineering in school, but I was frankly bored by it in school because, again, this was pre-commercial internet, and so we were mainly building drivers and server-based software, desktop software. And now I can look back at it and say, the problem was that I didn't have a feedback loop, right? We would create products, never know if anyone actually used them. Maybe someone would use them years later. They would put on disks, floppy disks, and then CD-ROMs and things like that. And so I had no connection to the customer. And it was really building things on the internet and having that kind of feedback loop cycle that I became kind of addicted to. And that's what led me to do this stuff. So I rose from being a software engineer, well, not rose, in some ways that was a lot more fun, but software engineer to starting companies, to being a CTO, to leading product teams, and then did that at various companies. My own company, sold my 4th company to a company called HubSpot when we were a 200 person or so company at that point, about 30 million in ARR, and then stayed there to run product.
Right?
Yeah, that company was Performable, and
what did you do?
At Performable, we were a marketing automation product. So, basically the insight that we had was that we were going to a world of kind of omni-channel presence, which is kind of obvious now, but this is 2009. And so we were taking signals from everything. And we were one of the first that I can remember in the marketing and sales world to actually have something called marketing world, I would say, to actually have user-based profiles, right? Because that was the only way you could unify across omni-channel. And I remember everyone that I could remember in that world saying it was the dumbest thing ever because marketers never looked at one person, they only looked at segments. And then obviously everything has a face in it, everything has a profile in it today.
Interesting. So what was the insight that led to Drift?
Yeah.
Why Drift and why now? I mean, why now when you started it?
Why now is probably the most important questions because a question I should say. You know, I've gone, if I think about my journey across 5 companies in 20 years, I would say that I started from a very engineering standpoint, which is like, it's all about the product. It's all about building the thing. It's all about scratching the itch. It's all about, you know, like eating your own dog food. And then I went all the way to the other end when I started Drift and said, like, what are the undeniable trends that are happening in the world, right? And how those changing user behavior? Because I figured out doing it this way that user behavior was almost impossible to change, right? And so like what were the changes externally that were affecting user behavior and changing our behavior? And then I started to look at those and realize that most of the stuff that we had built, even the stuff we had built at the most recent company, which was Performable and HubSpot, like didn't really make sense anymore because we believed that we were undergoing this paradigm shift where we were moving from a world where the company controlled the buying process, largely in the B2B space, to a world where the buyer had all the control, and that was driven because of mass commoditization in SaaS and a whole bunch of other trends that we were looking at. That was the why now we were starting the company, and why now is the question that we ask ourselves basically every day in everything that we build at Drift.
Mm-hmm. So I'd love to dive into the product part of this. So I think a lot
Sure.
of people are going to be familiar with Drift, and you know, I mean, for anybody that doesn't know, it will sound very familiar. You know, you get on a website that could be Snowflake, that could be Envision, that could be Grubhub, that could be GitHub, and then you're going to have that little window that's going to appear, that's going to pop up at the bottom right corner. Is going to say, "Can I help you?" or "Check out our next webinar." Like that's typically, or that's often powered by Drift. But there are actually a number of products which I personally hadn't realized before diving into this. There's a live chat product, there's a chatbot product, there's an email product, there's automation. So maybe let's take all of those and actually spend a good amount of time explaining what they do. So maybe starting with the live chat. Like what does that? Because it's not just a chat, right? There's targeting.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk through all that and talk through the thought process on it. Basically, what we've been trying to do from the beginning, which is invisible to everyone, is that we are trying to build a new type of CRM. Right. And we believe that we're doing that on a different type of data model, which is largely driven by conversational data. Right. But no one sees that. You have to start with a wedge in the market and then you have to expand from there. And our wedge was and is chat. Right. And website chat was not new. Website chat existed for my entire career, but something had changed externally. And that thing that had changed was that when we were using website chat a million years ago, like, it was not normal. It was just a bunch of us, you know, millions of us geeks like myself who thought this was normal to have a conversation with someone on a website. And because of that, it was largely relegated to a support use case, right? What was different when we started Drift and back to the why now was that, you know, from a messaging standpoint, we've all seen like all the charts, whether it's Mary Meeker's or other, just the adoption rate of messaging had gone largely driven because the smartphone had gone from millions of us geeks or very few of us to basically everyone in the world, right? You, your parents, your grandparents, your kids, you're like everyone defaulting to messaging. The reason that's important is not the technology. The reason that it's important is back to the user behavior change. Behavior change had happened. And we had gone from a world where we had defaulted to in-person and phone calls and things like that to a place where we all default now to some sort of messaging first before getting to those other types of communication. So that was the aha for us. And we said, okay, if that's true, now we think we can now finally use chat, live chat and website messaging in an actual sales use case where it had never been used successfully before. Things had been hacked together, but no one had really done it because the sales use case was very different, right? If you're a salesperson or a sales organization, the last thing you want to deal with is a support issue. And if you ever get a support issue, if you know anything about salespeople, if they get one support issue, they will never use this channel again, right? Because they will say it's noise and they will never use it. And so like the qualification part and the targeting part and the routing part and all of these kind of things that live chat never answered were really difficult questions, difficult things to figure out. And those are the things that we set out to build. That is the thing that's hidden underneath kind of the iceberg of our live chat, that from the surface, it kind of looks similar to other things, but like when you get into global routing rules and you get into targeting, whether it's ABM or other forms of targeting, whether you get into the qualification and what needs to happen before something gets surfaced as a sales ready lead or conversation, there's a lot that has to happen there. And so that's really what we worked on in that context. And
Right.
you're right, we have continued to grow into other communication channels. Video is one of them, not video like we're doing now with Zoom, but asynchronous video.
Yeah. So maybe on the live chat, so let's
Sure.
double click on some of this. So the ABM part, so what does that mean? That means so ABM is for anybody that is not familiar, account-based marketing. That means that you have a target list of accounts, and if you say FirstMark is one account that you're targeting, and I come on the website, then you're gonna recognize me. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so ABM is just a fancy word for what you just said, which is a target account list, which anyone who's been in enterprise sales, many of my companies have done enterprise sales for 20 plus years. Like that's ABM is a new acronym wrapped around this kind of idea. But if you sell in the enterprise, most of the time there's a very limited set of customers for you in the world. And so those are the only customers that you want to talk to. You don't want to talk to Joe the plumber. You want to talk to, Fortune 100 company only. And so what we do is for those companies, that subset of customer that we have that has that kind of target customer list, we make sure either through qualification from a conversational standpoint or all sorts of targeting, whether it is linking into emails, linking into various cookies, linking into IP-based rules, like all sorts of, there's like a million different ways that we do this thing. We make sure that their people only get surfaced people that are in, or companies that are in their target account list. It's very important. Like if they get anything outside of that, then again, the whole thing fails, right? The whole thing doesn't work in their view.
And then so you recognize me, and then you route me to the right rep. So if Joe Jane is like the FirstMark, kind of rep in charge of FirstMark, then the chat would go to them.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the next hard thing. So one is the recognizing you. That's a hard thing. The second thing is, okay, who owns this account, right? And it might be me. I might own them. And where in the world am I? And am I available right now? And if I'm not available, how do I get to you? And then how do I resurface that thing in case I wasn't available? And then how do I make that experience feel like a great, seamless experience for the buyer, right? Yourself. So how do I make that all happen? So that's the complicated thing that we have to figure out, and we have to do all the time. And most systems, again, when we think about all those systems, whether you could put together all the sales forces you want and all the add-ons and the 50 to 100 tools that people put on top of those existing systems today, none of them were built for a real-time world, right? Once you dig in from a technical standpoint, they were built for a world where real-time didn't matter, right? Because again, the paradigm was different. The company controlled the paradigm. They could get back to you whenever. That led to technical choices that are like batch-based systems, like, very old school systems that take a long time to surface those things. None of that stuff works. We had to build our own enterprise level routing system that has to work in real time and make decisions. That's closer to, from a technical standpoint, it's closer to an ad server than it is to what exists today in that world, right? Only out of need, because that doesn't exist today.
Mm-hmm. And then you have a chatbot product, right? Which is the automated version of this. What does that do? How does that work?
Sure. So that was something that we had to, that we brought in pretty early, and I we feel like we were probably the first ones that really did that from a website standpoint, which is like the sales qualification bot, right? To really figure out if you were qualified or who you should talk to. And, when we did it, we weren't sure if it was going to work, if the timing was right yet, if anyone wanted to have a conversation with a bot. And the truth is, like, the buyer doesn't care if it's a bot or not a bot or whatever. The buyer is selfish, just like all of us. And we want an answer to our question immediately. That's why it works. It doesn't work because it's a bot or not a bot. That we're kind of indifferent as buyers. We just like, if the option is I have a conversation with this thing, whatever this thing is, and I get an answer in real time versus I fill out some form and I wait, 2 weeks for someone to get back to me. I'm going to take this path, right? So that's the way it works. But, we started with a basic, decision tree based rule bot, which we still offer, to some customers. But then we have a very sophisticated, truly a machine learning based bot, which works by ingesting the conversations that you're having, whether those conversations are across email, website messaging, video. We ingest all of that conversation data, and we continue to do that over time. And then we build kind of an infinite model that actually takes into account the best performing reps and the best performing conversations and the context of all of that to build that out so that the company, our customer, doesn't have to build any rules. Right? They don't build any rules. We ingest data and we create all of that rule-based system for them.
Yeah, since we're on the topic, I read, I thought that was very interesting. So there's a concept of AI designer, right?
Yes. Yep.
So
yep.
so in very sort of practical terms, what does that mean? That means you say, hey, I want the Drift powered chatbot, and then there's going to be somebody from the Drift team that's going to just go through the history of conversations, for example, and then identify the conversations that are the most interesting, and then I guess I'm asking
they don't
human and AI.
Sure. We have this idea of our system is augmented by humans, which are these AI designers, and again, the reason that we do that is because our customer, and more importantly, the buyer doesn't care. The buyer doesn't care about, just like when you search on Google or you do something on Uber, you do something on Facebook, I'm just using random examples, or Amazon, you just want the best result possible. Again, you don't care if that was AI, hard-coded algorithm, AI plus, 4,000 people that they have in India who are hand pruning a model. Like, that stuff doesn't matter. Like, we're too lost in that kind of thinking, I think, in the enterprise tech world of like caring about software. Look at the way that we live our lives today. We use software all the time. Guess what? Nobody cares about software, right? Like, we're still talking about things like we did 10 years or 15 years ago about like hand building PCs. Like, we care about like PCs and specs and chips and this. Like, nobody cares about this. They care about an outcome. We buy outcomes now. We buy experiences. We don't buy software. So that's a whole nother tangent I can go on. But like, the way the system works, to answer your question, is that, look, we take the AI designer, which is a human team, basically does not go through the conversations and sit there and say this one's good and this one's bad. They deal with exceptions, right? And the infinite thing in all data processing is that there's infinite exceptions that are going to happen over time. They take those exceptions and then they make sure that we have the ability to train the next time an exception like that happens. And then that collectively across the entire customer base continues to get better and smarter over time. So that's what they do. There's a very limited window and amount of time that those AI designers are actually spend in dealing with this. It's very, very limited. It's a very small team.
Interesting. And there's that concept of learning across the network of customers, of data network.
Absolutely.
Effect, where the AI becomes better with each new customer that's added to the network.
Yeah, and that's more from a, you would expect from a grammar and a context standpoint, right? Not from any type of sensitive information.
Mm-hmm. And that's really, it's an interesting topic because there's some debate about it, but like that's something that you've seen across, actually an improvement of the AI.
Oh yeah, 100%, 1,000%. And then we have to do that across many language sets. So like, we don't only do that across English, but we have to do that across, and any of us who speak multiple languages understand like there's a lot of fixes that we have to do from a language and standpoint when it comes to understanding other grammars and other slang.
Yeah. And how does the interplay between the two products work, right? Because to some extent, they almost like AntiTheta
compete.
What's that?
Yeah, they almost compete with each other. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I think I think for the most successful, our biggest and most successful customers will use the automated product, right, over time. And I think it depends on the size of the company and kind of the readiness that they have and how weary they are to go all the way to that end. And so a lot of our customers start with a decision tree based approach, and then they go pretty quickly to that other approach because, you know, decision trees don't work after a time, right? So like anyone who's used a marketing tool or a sales based tool or any business productivity tool at some point is dealing with these decision trees and trying to hard code and guess at what the next step will be. And, you know, in a conversation, it's almost impossible to actually guess those things, right? And so they move pretty quickly to that end, but it's obviously more expensive. It's in our enterprise packages. And so like people have to graduate or self-elect into that place. But I think it's the place that we want everyone to go in. And I think over time, for sure, it is the place where our entire product will look more like that than it does, and get rid of all the decision trees pretty soon.
Is that right? But to make sure I understand, so the future is automation first as opposed to human first?
100% across every product that we do. I think it goes back to my mini rant that I just had there. I don't think people care about software anymore. I think the reality that we're in, especially in our context where we are in sales and marketing software, right, in the world of Salesforce and all those kind of tools, is like the idea that you need 50 to 100 tools, which is not an exaggeration. If you think it's an exaggeration, you should spend time and audit the actual expenses of your teams, no matter how small or big. 50 to 100 tools that are loosely coupled together, that are passing data or sort of trying to pass data using Zapier, MuleSoft, et cetera, Tray.io, a million other tools, and an entire business operations team that is dealing with that thing. If you think that is the future of software, I think you're mistaken. I disagree with you. I don't think that's the way the world is going. And so like, that is where we are now. And that's just an artifact of time. And I think we are moving to a totally different world. And it looks like, it doesn't take much imagination because it looks like a lot of the software or the tools or the outcomes that we seek in our personal lives. Like nothing works like that if you look at it on your personal life. Like nothing works the way that we expect things to work in the B2B world, in your personal life.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, how do you think about integrations with the rest of those tools in the enterprise? I mean, ultimately, are you trying? I mean, I'm sure you're in this to win and build the platform, but like, is the end game to be like the system of record for all conversations, or are you partnering? Are you building? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it depends on depends when. I think, you know, like we have a very long view on what we're trying to do, and you know, that path is from the very beginning has been working with existing tools and systems today, because I think the idea that you're just going to rip something out and just going to replace something is not going to work. Those tools are going to exist for a very long time. And so we integrate into those things, we write back to those things, we are partners with all of those systems. But we think, you know, what we're trying to do is create that layer or that interface for the people that on your team and the automation, you know, the bots, let's say, that actually have conversations with your customers, right? So like, think about all the people that have conversations in the company with your customers or your prospects. That starts at sales, but that can be support, that can be your account management, your CS teams, et cetera, your technical service teams. All those people are having conversations with your customer today. We want to be the interface for those people. And then we will continue to write back and deal with all the systems underneath, but like they shouldn't have to worry about those systems, right? Again, like this idea that we have today of a CRM or a centralized place to keep all this information is a pretty insane system, right? This idea that humans enter things into one big ledger and they have to enter it in a certain format, and all those humans actually have no incentive whatsoever to ever enter anything into the system. Like they have the opposite of incentive, right, to put it in there, is like the craziest system. So like we like to do a lot of things, like we like to abstract out and think of things and invert and think of things from just a human storytelling standpoint. And if you were to tell someone from a storytelling standpoint what a CRM today is, it would be the most insane idea ever, right? This idea that people enter stuff in and they type stuff in, and if it's not in the perfect format, in the perfect field, then the whole thing doesn't work. And like, it's the most crazy thing ever, but we have accepted this reality, and we're stuck in this reality. And I don't think that's the future.
Interesting. You want to talk briefly maybe about the other product, so the email
Sure.
product?
Mm-hmm.
What does that do?
So, basically the idea that we continue to march down is like, how do we, if there is a conversation that's happening with the customer, right? The buyer doesn't only want to have a conversation in one channel. The buyer is kind of like what we did at Performer, is across all these channels, right? It's this omni-channel thing. And so like, and during your buying journey and your customer journey, you're going to bounce through all those things. You're going to go from website chat, you'll go through email, sometimes you go back to video, asynchronous, synchronous video, synchronous being like Zoom that we're using now. Sometimes you have a phone call, sometimes all of those things. And then like, if you get into a big company where you have lots of people involved with this product or this company, there's lots of those conversations happening. So for us, it was like, how do we start to get in the middle of those conversations? Because it's important for us to capture that context and the conversation data. And more importantly, how do we provide a better experience for the buyer? Because again, fundamentally, we believe that this paradigm shift has already happened, company controlled to buyer controlled. So like everything we do starts with inverting the existing model and saying like, how do we make the buyer experience better? And so we say, okay, email, for example, we say, okay, email, like, again, if you think about it from a simple standpoint, it's a kind of a crazy system, right? We have marketing automation systems and now we have sales engagement systems, right? That is an artifact of time, right? Back in the day, we would send, email was a one-to-one communication tool only. Then we messed it up in some degree, right? From a marketing standpoint, and turned it into a one-to-many system. But now we have a one-to-many system that is communicating with your customers that has no ability for those customers to ever reply back in a two-way communication channel, right? So like you get all these emails, you can't reply back, try replying back to a marketing email, it'll bounce back and say, no reply at, and don't contact me. Crazy idea. So we said like, okay, how do we take those marketing automation systems and sales engagement systems and make them a two-way communication thing? So like I could just like, if I was a company and I was marketing to you, I could just say like, hey, do you want to come to the event? And you could just say yes, right? Not like click on a link, open a landing page, fill out a form, re-engage the whole thing, get resynced into 15 different systems. Like the whole thing is insane. And so like our email bot product basically does that. It allows those marketing automation systems. And again, we play with Marketo and Eloqua and all those systems you use today, but we turn it into a two-way communication channel. More importantly, so it's a better buyer experience, but more importantly, like if they reply, that then goes back into global routing and gets routed back to a salesperson. So a salesperson has context and they say, hey, Jack just replied to a marketing email, said he's going to an event, and they know about that event. That doesn't exist in the world today. So that's what we brought.
Yeah. And I read this whole sort of like cool stuff as well, where it captures data as well. So if
Oh,
you're
yeah.
in your sort of like signature block, if your phone number has changed, the system will automatically capture that and update the CRM.
Absolutely. All of our systems have that in common, whether it's video, whether it's chat, or in this case, email. It is constantly updating the system of record because, again, the idea that a human's going to do that by hand is a crazy idea.
Very cool. So maybe switching gear a little bit away from product and into go-to-market. Maybe talk about how you guys have been able to sort of differentiate in terms of marketing positioning, and especially in a category that's pretty noisy, with chatbots and all the things. Like I see you guys have been. It looks like you've been working on creating a category. So I'm curious how you thought about it.
Sure, thought a lot about it. So I will first start by saying that that I have a different view on commoditized markets versus not. I think when I was at HubSpot, we would religiously read Blue Ocean Strategy and talk about blue oceans versus red oceans, and I think everyone got obsessed with this idea of finding these perfect blue oceans where there's zero competition and they create these things. My argument even back then was a market. Most of the time, a market that has no competition is not a market, right? So therefore, you are cannibalizing from something. There is a red ocean somewhere. So my view, which kind of came from that perspective when I started Drift, was look, I want to go into the most commoditized market possible, right? Really, we're trying to go in the CRM market. And so I want to go in that red ocean. But what I want to understand going in is understand that it's a red ocean, understand that we need a fundamentally different paradigm and technical shift, right? So that we can resegment and recategorize this market so that we have an opportunity to win. right? That's a very different approach than saying like, it's a red ocean, I'm just going to build a Me Too product and like somehow I'm going to win because it's nicer. That's not going to win. So like we had a very deliberate view. And so part of that view was like, go into this commoditized market, have a wedge approach, and then figure out like, how do we expand that wedge over time? Can we create a category? What is that category? We created a category called conversational marketing, a name I hated, you know, because it was so long that I didn't think anyone could spell it. But then we woke up one day, we did that like in 2016, 17. And then we woke up one day and then Gartner recognized it for us, their Serious Decisions, all those people. Wiley asked us to write a book. We wrote a book on it in 2019. And now, you know, like everyone from Salesforce to whoever calls himself conversational marketing in some way. That's nice, but like, you know, for us, like that had little to do with us and it had to do with a shift that was happening in the world. And we didn't know when that shift, when other people would recognize that shift, but we thought if we were at all right in our belief that all these companies would have to move into this space, right? Like we would have to go from a world where we were the only ones saying we were a conversational marketing tool to now we have at least 100 companies, a lot of them public and very large, who use this category definition, right? And so like that's more validation of the market and the readiness, less about drift for sure. So anyway, category creation is an interesting thing. Spend a lot of time thinking that, and you know, because of where we are in from a SaaS commoditization standpoint, at the very beginning of Drift, and we continue to do this, my view was like, we have to build a global brand. We have to build a global brand. I don't want to build a tech brand. I don't want to build a software brand. I don't want to build a Boston brand or a San Francisco brand or a New York brand. Like, I don't want any of that. We have to fundamentally build a global brand because we are in a different part of the cycle right now where we are closer to Procter and Gamble and selling Tide soap than we are in like, you know, building homebrew computers and building, you know, Apple and early Microsoft, right? Like it's just a different part of the cycle. And so like you have to understand what part of the cycle you are in your market and then market or go to market appropriately.
How do you sell today? I mean, 50,000 customers is a huge number of customers. So presumably you have a bottoms up type approach. How does that work?
Yeah, lots of ways. I think, you know, we went into market in 2017 as the first time we sold anything, which was a total touchless approach, right? Freemium. So everyone knows that, touchless. We had no salespeople. That was it. And we got a lot of customers early on from that approach. And then in 2018, we added and we started to experiment with this idea of like, can we add in some, you know, some salespeople? And I had done this at my last company, Performable. I didn't know this was going to work. I thought of it more as kind of like an A/B test to understand like what could they do versus this. And we approached it that way, very much so of like, not that we were going to change our model, but like that we had this ability to bring on this team. Let's see what they can do. Worst case is that they could sell nothing or it was a highly inefficient model, but at least we would capture data and we would capture conversation. We would force conversations to happen every single day that weren't happening. And we could capture that from a data standpoint and learn and adapt. And so 2018, we did that and all of a sudden like, wow, that started to really work. And that model looked like a high velocity inside sales model, super high velocity model where, you know, we would call them one chat closes and they would basically close on one conversation kind of thing. And those are typically more, you know, your SMB, low kind of mid-market type business. And then over time, what has happened is we started to get more and more adoption from what we consider more enterprise type companies. And again, you know, our definition, and everyone has different segment definitions, but like for us, you know, they were in classical sense, they'd be like low to mid enterprise type companies. Like, and those companies started to adopt us largely in enterprise tech, although now it's across kind of all different verticals. And we started to see success there. And then what we realized, it's all obvious in hindsight, was that in some ways we were a way better value proposition for those type of companies than all the rest, because they really had big problems, right? In terms of like all the stuff we talked about, global routing and all these kind of things, and like different segments, different markets that were in, different product lines, and like all this kind of stuff, like the complexity of their product and the complexity of their workforce, meaning all of these salespeople, account managers, blah, 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 et cetera, like really made our product really valuable and really work there. in a way that we hadn't seen even in the other pockets where it works amazingly well, but in these pockets it was amazing. And then from a payback standpoint, like it was a very easy proposition, right? Because if you're selling a, you know, 300,000, you know, $1 million, $50 million kind of ACV type product, like it doesn't take many conversions to pay for us from a product standpoint. Right.
All right, great. Probably have
And those
like
things,
another...
sorry, I was going to say one more thing. I'd say those things are happening today. I think one of the biggest things that we saw that we didn't think would happen this quickly is because of this pandemic that we've gone through, like the forced digital transformation of the high enterprise is like, is pretty insane for us. And so like, you know, all these people had thought, right or wrong, that you could never close a $300,000 deal, $1 million deal, $20 million deal without getting on a plane and steak dinners and this. And guess what? 100% of them across the world have to do it right now. And so we believe that we've seen a 10-year acceleration in digital transformation in our market easily. And we see it every day. Yeah.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. This is fascinating. I've got so many other questions, but I want to give some time for the Q&A from folks on the chat. Jack, if you have some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you, David and Matt, for that fantastic conversation. So let's start with Nicholas's question. David, what's next on the road between the current chat environment and the new type of CRM that you propose?
I wish I knew. Nicholas, if you have the answer, please tell me. It's an iterative process. I think, for us, we look at it two ways. We look at it from fundamentally, how do we change the buyer experience for the better? And so we are obsessed with that. That's number one. And so that's our guiding light. And so we're constantly looking like, how do we make it a little bit better? And then we measure that by how much from a pipeline standpoint, and then a revenue standpoint, we're able to affect our customers. And we can track that throughout the entire cycle, even post sale. And so like we track that, and that's how we can tell that we're having more an effect. From a product standpoint, I think what we look at is that how do we get more of those people who are having conversations with your prospect, buyer, and then customer to actually spend more time in Drift, and that's a little bit easier to measure. And so like our product kind of pipeline kind of looks like, or roadmap kind of looks like us spending a lot of time trying to answer that question. How do they spend more time? How do we automate more? How do we make the buyer experience simpler? And if we could do those things, the outcome will be this kind of future CRM that we think of.
That's great. Thank you. So quick question, knowing the importance of the feedback loop, especially with either other companies that you started, how did you change the way you ingrained that in the Drift culture early on? Just to quote feedback loop.
Yeah, I love that question because it's so near and dear to how I think and my heart, right? Because I would say like that is fundamentally the most important thing at Drift. And it was kind of a happy accident that I had at Performable in 2009 of like forcing everyone in the company, because we were so small, to do support. And, I had the aha moment that when we did that, when engineers finally did that and they did it kicking and screaming, like that, all of a sudden amazing things happen for our customers, things that were fundamentally impossible before when we were asking for them internally, magically were done overnight. Like all these things happen, and it was basically the discovery of the feedback loop, right? You had putting people who actually can change things as close to the customer as possible, having them feel that pain, have that empathy, and then have the ability to change is way better than a few people at the top trying to dictate that throughout your company. And so at Drift, it's been fundamental. Basically every single team in the company is measured in some way around how much time they actually spend with customers and how much time they're forced into that uncomfortable situation of having to deal with customer and then buyer pain, right? We have our internal customers, but also our buyers. And so like, that's how we fundamentally think about things. And, we have all sorts of guardrails and systems and ways of thinking of like, including, accepting and talking about all the time that we believe that every idea that we have is fundamentally wrong, right? It's 100% wrong. And our job is to get out there, get feedback and figure out how off they are. Is it 1% off or is it 100% off? There's no idea that is perfect at the get-go, no matter how many movies you watch.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So this one from David, and I know you touched briefly at the end of the discussion on COVID impact, but would just love to hear, maybe takeaways from COVID, how you've seen conversations change. Anything you can share about that would be really interesting.
Sure. So if at first, like everyone else, we didn't know what was going on, and we saw a hit in our kind of VSB, so our very small business and SMB segment, which then recovered in kind of May, June. And then mid-market was kind of a little affected, and then enterprise, we were always surprised from the beginning, was unaffected, right? And that was in the early days. And then what we saw was a fast acceleration in the enterprise segments and somewhat in the mid-market. And from a conversation standpoint, I think what we saw was kind of what I touched on before, which was all of a sudden a lot more conversations were happening, and because we can track revenue and kind of pipeline, a lot more conversations were happening with your higher kind of dollar ACV type products or services. And so like all of a sudden, like those big decision makers and those big sales that companies were making, more and more of those were happening online, right? Versus offline, whether that was through email or on the website or through video. And so like we've seen a massive change there happen. And I think that behavior change won't go back. And so some of it will go back, but from an efficiency standpoint, it's too efficient, and the incentives are set up for companies to continue to go that way.
That's great. Appreciate that. So this one's a little bit more straightforward, but how quickly are you able to stand up a Drift implementation in a standard, B2B setting? Is it hours, days?
Hours, I think, and then it go all the way on the other end of, a massive enterprise customer who could take, a month, I would say, is probably the longest, but that has to do with humans and not technology at all. Yeah. That is like, change management 101.
Absolutely. And then outside of traditional, B2B and B2C, are there any kind of unique use cases you're seeing, for example, local, state, federal government?
We haven't branched off into those areas. I think, we try to stay focused on, we think our market is considered purchases, right? Yeah. There are two types of purchases online, which are transactional. We do those every day, Amazon, etc. And then there are considered purchases. And then we narrowed that even more in the beginning of just to say B2B, but really there are all sorts of considered purchases. And one of the ones that we love the most is a customer called Peloton, which all of us know, right? Like that's a B2C thing, but like that's a highly considered purchase, and they sell, somewhere like between 40 and 50% of their bikes over website messages, right? And so yep. That will be the bikes, that will be the subscriptions, that will be, the care involved in that. And so like that is a massive amount of transactions that are happening over the system. And so like we see a lot of systems like that going on right now in the B2C world. So it's interesting.
That's great. Matt, maybe one more?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, this is hopefully a softball for you, but Andrew asks, what book do you find yourself recommending the most right now?
Oh my goodness. For me, if you know me, like I'm so obsessive around books and podcasts so much about books, like that's a hard one. I think the one that I would say that I give away the most and that I reread the most is Peter Drucker's Managing Oneself, which is like a $5, pamphlet basically that you can buy. Everyone should buy that. And I think it's important to reread that book every, 3 to 5 years, because every 3 to 5 years you're in an entirely different context and will take something away from it. And it's tiny, and you'll read it maybe in an hour, and it's worth your $5.
Amazing. Thank you.
Very interesting. And by the way, for anyone that's not familiar with that part of David's work, so David has a site, he has a newsletter and a podcast on life lessons, which is really, really interesting. Where do they find that, David? What are some?
My podcast is called Seeking Wisdom, but you can just go to drift.com and you'll see it easily.
Very cool. Well, on that note, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed it. So really appreciate your coming on today to share this with the group. Thank you so much, David.